Okay, then just, oh, I see. Okay, that's fine. Just 1 second. I have the usual problem here with the okay. Sorry, 1 moment more, and I'll be with you in a second. Don't know why, but I just can't get my system open. Okay, I hope this is better. Sorry, I just had some usual problems with opening the file. Now, what we were seeing yesterday was the role that international organizations have had in somehow trying to shape the governance of the whole world, and therefore in international relations. And we have seen in the past, after World War I, the failure of the League of Nations, which was set up with the purpose of trying to guarantee peace. It did not work, and if you think of it, there were only 20 years between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second World War. So this was a failure. And so after World War II, there was a renewed attempt to set up international organizations, somehow to guarantee sort of to avoid that what had happened in the past could repeat itself. Now, what the main, now let's see if I can open here. Okay. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So the main international organization, which you all know about, is the United Nations, the UN, short in short terms, the UN, which is founded in 1945, June 1945, just after substantially the fall of Nazi Germany. The war with Japan was still going on and ended only in August 45, but in this founding moment in San Francisco, in the US, where the Allied countries, which were in the sort of allied against the Axis powers, that is Germany, Italy, and Japan, founded the United Nations. And now there were 50 at the beginning, now we have 193 member states. So as you see, it has grown considerably also because since the end of the Second World War, there's been this process of so-called decolonization, in the sense that the main powers, the European powers, that is France and England and UK, that had vast colonial dominions around the world, well, they gave up mostly in Africa and Asia. They gave up their colonies, which became independent states. So now the UN is 193 members. And just to remind you, this is one of the main issues, but we'll discuss if you study international organizations, you will understand this better. One of the main limits of the UN is that it was based on egalitarian basis. That is, each state is equal to another. Now this, well, it's very nice, but then if you start saying that in the UN, the US is equal to some tiny state in the Pacific Ocean, Vanuatu, rather than Fiji, well, I mean, it's exaggerating a little bit the notion of sort of equality in front of international law. At any rate, so we have 193 member states, and the objectives are, and these are what are set out in its founding papers, acts, maintain international peace and security, develop friendly relations between nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. So this here you already see some very strong political stance, achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character. So you see, very broad. Obviously, 1945, the major concern were the war with Japan hadn't finished, the war with Germany and Italy had just finished, so, and the peace talks hadn't even started. So you see there was a very broad idea of what the objectives of the UN should have been. Now, what we are interested in this, remember we are, so this is not an international law class, it is not even international organizations class, it is a comparative legal systems. What we are focusing on is trying to understand how certain institutions work and how they shape legal systems. So the main organ of the UN is its Security Council. And this is what we generally hear, the Security Council has decided this, the Security Council has been convened to discuss a certain matter, and so on. So we have 15 members, and of these 15 members, 10 are rotation, so all the continents are somehow represented, Asia, Africa, the Americas, Europe, and 10 are rotating, but there are 5 members who are permanent members of the Security Council. Permanent members means that they're always there. That is the US, Russia, once upon a time was the Soviet Union, China, now it is the People's Republic of China. Until the 1970s, it was only what we call Taiwan, the island of Taiwan, which is independent from mainland China, then France and Great Britain. So these 5 permanent members are very important because they have also what is called the power of veto. They can veto. Veto obviously is the way through which sort of the English pronunciation of veto, which is obviously a Latin expression by which you prohibit. So any decision which is taken by the Security Council may be vetoed, may be blocked by one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, just to show how important really what is the General Assembly, which meets every year in autumn in New York, is not so important. What is important is what the Security Council decides, when it manages to decide, when the 5 permanent members agree. Now, what are the main legal documents on which the UN is founded? The Charter, which is the charter on which the UN obviously it's a legal document on which the UN is founded, that is 111 articles, very long. And then, and here I would like to bring you back to what we started discussing at the beginning of of the course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, which has influenced national constitution and other conventions on human rights. So we see that this, in that period, sort of from the end of World War II, 1945, and in the years immediately afterwards, we find a series of conventions on human rights, whether international convention, the UN Convention on Human Rights, and other conventions, the European Convention on Human Rights of 1950, and they have strongly influenced when we look at the opening articles of modern constitutions, Italian Constitution 1948, German Constitution 1949, and subsequent constitutions. We find many of these principles, we find them in both constitutions and human rights declarations. This is very important because it shows how there was, and there still is, a consensus about, international consensus of what human rights are, or at least what they were considered in that precise moment. So this is the first element that I would like to point out to you, how international organized, in this case, an international treaty that founded the UN and that voted the International Declaration of Human Rights has influenced domestic legal systems. Italian Constitution, German Constitution, and subsequently constitutions of other countries that followed Italian and German example from the structure of a constitution. And this Universal Declaration of Human Rights has subsequently been evolved in a more complex international agreement, the 1976 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which we generally call as also known as New York Covenant. So just to point out that the UN has somehow significantly forged the structure of human rights worldwide. A country to join the UN must accept the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but this shows that this declaration is mostly in the paper, just in writing, but does not exist. Out of these 193 countries, well, at least more than half are more or less dictatorships, where these fundamental human rights set out in the Universal Declaration obviously are not respected. Just to point out that sort of the difference that there is between a very important international document, the Universal Declaration, and then the day-to-day practice of in each country, in the countries, and not all countries. As a matter of fact, most of the members of the UN completely disregard the declaration. Now, what are we interested in? Obviously, we're not going to analyze all the things the UN does. We're going to look only those aspects that are more interested in from an international law perspective in relation to the shaping of a legal system. The first is that interventions of the UN, two kinds of interventions. Peacekeeping operations, which they have always been doing since the 1950s in the Middle East, various occasions still now in the Middle East, Lebanon or other parts of the Middle East. Congo, when years of decolonization, Cyprus, Western Sahara, Cambodia, Somalia, Rwanda, Haiti. So you see peacekeeping operations. This means that troops are sent in, but with non-armed, with no, they cannot attack, they can only their function is that of peacekeeping and avoiding civil war or conflict in a certain area or certain country. And second element, what we find repeatedly, and mostly in these last 30 years, these so-called humanitarian interventions. The idea that the UN can intervene to somehow, in case when there is some humanitarian disaster, mostly, but not of a natural disaster, but mostly of a military nation, sort of extermination of parts of population and so on. And here we have three noticeable examples: Iraq, Bosnia, and the Balkans, and Libya. There's a great deal of discussion among lawyers on the sort of if these interventions were justified or not. What I would like you to keep in mind is that the main objection that is made to these interventions is that they go against the principle of state sovereignty in its internal affairs, which is one of the pillars of the Westphalia peace principles that we saw yesterday. So the idea that each state has sovereignty over its own territory, and other nations may not interfere in the internal affairs of a state. The reason why these humanitarian interventions, however, are rather few, are due to the fact that all the 5 permanent members of the Security Council must agree. If one of them, Russia or China or the US, veto this intervention, obviously this means that there can be no intervention by the US, by the UN. Sorry. Just to point out that why are we interested in this? Because we see that when we're talking of legal systems and we establish the principle of sovereignty as the fact that each country can decide its own rules, institutions, and legal system, well, we see that in certain extreme cases, well, this is not possible because the global international organization decides that certain things cannot be done and things have to be changed, and can even intervene in a military way to change things. Just to point out that when we're looking at legal systems and we think that they're self-sufficient, well, we must always remember that there are external interventions that could happen. Very dramatic in these cases that I've mentioned, but we shall see less dramatically in other circumstances that we shall analyze in a few slides. Just to point out the notion of sovereignty, when we focus on sovereignty, on state sovereignty, just to keep in mind that this is not an absolute, because it is repeatedly overruled by international decisions. Now, this is looking at more or less what the UN tells us, has done. Now, what is interesting is that the UN has created a global international organization, but has a whole lot of specialized agencies. That is some sub-organizations to which most of the 193 members of the UN are part, on the most diverse aspects. Look, for example, Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, which is based in Rome, International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, again here in Rome, World Health Organization, which is in the somehow under sort of very strong attack by President Trump. But anyhow, international organization based in Geneva. Then we find the World Meteorological Organization, which is very important because when we start looking at climate change, obviously we are interested in understanding what are the indications about climate. And then the International Labour Organization, again based in Geneva, which should set general principles on how sort of work should be conducted and guarantees for workers and avoiding exploitation of workers. Whether it is successful or not is to be seen. International Maritime Organization, which is a very important organization which sets a whole lot of standards for in the shipping industry. You should consider that the shipping industry with globalization has grown incredibly because goods have to be, merchandises have to be transferred from one part or another of the globe, and this generally happens by sea. Therefore, there's been an enormous increase in maritime transport, and the IMO sets a whole series of standards which are very important in this field. If anybody of you ever enters the field of maritime law, will see that many of the rules are set technical rules, but technical legal rules are set by the IMO, based in, quite rightly so, in London, which is the capital, international capital of maritime trade. And then International Civil Aviation Organization, which sets a whole lot of principles in the field of transport, mostly of passenger transport, based in Canada, the Universal Postal Unit, the International Telecommunications Union, which is very important in these times because it sets the standards for telecommunications around the world in order to ensure that there is a common telecommunication network around the world. So again, technical rules, but a lot of also which are legally binding. And then UNESCO, based in Paris, the UN Organization for Education, Science and Culture, the WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, based again in Geneva. And then finally, I put them for the last because we're going to analyze these in a moment, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, both based in Washington, D.C., the US. So just to show you, I mean, the areas, the very wide areas, and here we are sort of, you can easily understand that if wherever you move in the law and you try to find a sort of what are the rules that regulate international relations in these fields, well, somehow you have to, you bump into a whole lot of rules and principles which are set out by these UN agencies. So this is why we're so interested in understanding the UN system, because all the whole list of rules, some more, some less. I mean, when it comes to civil aviation, obviously very important because we want to ensure that there are standards of when there are planes traveling from one part or another of the world, we want them to be in conformity with certain technical and safety rules, the same for ships, but also when it comes to intellectual property, or it comes to obviously health and understanding what exactly, when we are having an epidemic, what is a pandemic, and what are the measures that have to be taken in these cases. So just to show you that we are, these agencies are very important for global governance, surely, but also for us lawyers when we are interested in understanding how the legal system in these areas work. And as I've mentioned, international law is, even if you follow a dualistic model, that is, that international law is outside one's own domestic legal system and can come in the legal system only when Parliament ratifies that treaty and establishes that that treaty is part of the domestic legal order. Also, in that case, in this dualistic model, well, we see that all these international agencies, UN agencies, have a very important role in shaping areas of the law, whether we are talking of agriculture or technology, or we are talking of health devices or of intellectual property. Just to show that why we're interested in seeing what these agencies are doing. Now, once we have seen this list, what I will try to do is focus on the last two, the ones that were in bold, highlighted in bold red characters. Because while the UN attempts, tries, endeavors, whether it manages, well, this is something historians, and we leave that to historians, to ensure political governance, and therefore on highly political issues or trying to solve conflicts between countries. Let's avoid sort of nearby conflicts, but let's look at the conflict which is pretty far away from us and that hasn't been solved over the last 70 years, the conflict between India and Pakistan about Kashmir and the borders between these two countries. Well, the UN has attempted all the time to solve this conflict, and we see that there's no way of solving this conflict over the last 70 years. So just to point out that it is very difficult solving, even if you have an international organization which is reputable and strong and everybody's inside there, well, it is difficult to have the two countries find peaceful agreements. Now, these are political issues, which obviously are hopefully solved by, or the conflicts are somehow kept sort of at a lower level through legal instruments, agreements. What we are going to focus now are economic and financial governance of the world, which is the main objective of other international institutions. We have seen listed the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. We will see also others. Why are we so interested in these international organizations concerned with economic and financial world governance? Because clearly we see how in a global world, and this global world starts more or less when China, People's Republic of China, comes out of a harsh communist rule, which was a substantial lockdown of a whole country of that time of nearly 1 billion inhabitants, and there were practically no relations with the outside world. It started emerging about 40 years ago, and gradually, it opens up, and the turning point, the great turning point, is when in 2001, the People's Republic of China joins the World Trade Organization. We shall see this later on. But this means that suddenly China, with its 1 billion and a half inhabitants, are there open to receive, to consume, to become consumers of domestic and imported goods. The whole skyline of Chinese town changes dramatically. You just look at the skyline of Shanghai or any other Chinese town, you see skyscrapers. And this means sort of China is present as an economic strength all around the world, and certain continents very much more than European or American countries. And the second element, which is more or less in the same time, and when in 1989 the sort of the Soviet Union system, the communist system of the Soviet Union collapses, and with it collapse all Soviet communist regimes in Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, and this again opens enormous perspectives of the European level. So this is the turning point. And this is why we're so interested in economic and financial governance, because this has to do with, well, with international relations, but obviously has to do with legal relations. I mean, here we're talking of trade, we're talking of exchanges, we're talking of provision of services, we're talking of money that goes, huge amounts of money that go in one direction or another, infrastructures that have to be built. Just think of building airports in China or railways in Russia, just to show that this means an enormous increase in economic and entrepreneurship activities. And this means that we are, obviously this is work for lawyers, because behind trade, obviously, as we have seen already yesterday, well, there are lawyers that are writing contracts, agreements, and so on. And so this framework is very important for us to understand. And there are also institutional aspects that we shall see in a moment. Now, these two twin institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, which were founded substantially at the same time, same place, this rather mountain ski resort in North Hampshire, New Hampshire, that is eastern coast of the northeastern coast of the US, Bretton Woods. 1944. It wasn't even, the World War hadn't even finished. You could see it was about to finish, because there'd already been D-Day, so the Allied forces had landed in Normandy and were gradually moving towards sort of liberating Europe from Nazi occupation. And 1944, there's this international meeting with obviously the Allied countries, and trying to find sort of a new economic order, world economic order. Focus, obviously, post-war reconstruction and international financial stability. So 1944, already they were thinking of, we have to rebuild what has been destroyed in the war. The war will end only a year later, but they are already thinking, and they they put in the system also international financial stability, because in the general evaluation of those times, of those days, we're talking 1944, but it is sort of, historians have analyzed this a lot and discussed a lot. Among one of the reasons of the Second World War is the fact that there was, after the 1929 Wall Street crash, there was very strong repercussions, not only Great Depression in the US, but very negative consequences also in Europe, and this somehow favored the development of dictatorships in Europe. The idea that the only way to go out of this dramatic financial crisis was that of a strong dictator in the case of Germany and also other countries. Italy was already there since 1922, and before the crash. So just to point out that historians are doubtful that really the Wall Street crack really brought to sort of the seize of power by dictatorships in Europe. But anyhow, financial stability, international financial stability is seen as an element of necessary for the reconstruction. So what is when we look at the IMF and the World Bank, we as lawyers, we realize that we are entering someone else's, well, building or palace, or call it whatever you want. We are entering in the field which does not really belong to us lawyers. Because it is a field in which what dominates are economic theories. Now, clearly, we lawyers, we don't have we have our doubts on the wisdom of economic theories, but this is not sort of a place. This class is not the sort of where we're going to do a duel between economists and lawyers. But just to point out that we as lawyers, we cannot understand certain rules and certain legal systems if we don't understand what are the economic ideas behind these rules. And behind the IMF and the World Bank, there are very, very clear economic theories that have been, well, sometimes confirmed, sometimes have been not confirmed, and there's a lot of debate whether IMF and World Bank have really understood well the economic, when they present theories and then act on those and ask lawyers to put these economic theories into place, because you need laws to put economic theories into place. Well, there's a whole lot of debate. We won't discuss about that. The important thing is that you should know, as students, you should know that when we're looking at IMF and World Bank, we have to understand what is the economic background. Because if we look only at the rules, well, we don't understand why are these rules there. So what I'll be doing here now in the next slides will be trying to bring you in the simplest way possible in the sort of the basic ideas that are behind economic theories that are behind the IMF and the World Bank. And we should see immediately what are the legal consequences, because we are not we are interested in this because they shape our legal system. Yeah, we see our legal systems are very nice. We build constitutions, bills of rights, codes of all kinds, jurisdiction and so on. Built this wonderful palace, legal palace, and then we realize that this legal palace is strongly somehow dependent on something that comes from outside, that is economic theory. So we'll see this in a moment. What I want to do now, just one moment, is any questions on this first part? Mostly concerning the UN system. Apart from Adimari, who yesterday was asking if we would discuss the tweet by Donald Trump saying that the US will not finance any longer WHO, but that I think I suggest that Adimari joins the real Donald tweet and sort of and asked the real Donald to give answers to this question. I cannot give any questions. Now, what do you say about USSR? Now, first point. Remember that I trust you have a basic historical knowledge. You know, there was a Russian empire, there was an emperor, and then there was a Russian revolution in 1917, by which the Communist Party took power in Russia and declared that that was the Soviet Union, or that is the union of the Soviet Socialist republics. So this system went on substantially from 1917 to 1989, and then and after World War II, when the Soviet troops moved west, after to push back the German troops, they progressively occupied most of Eastern Europe, which most of them were also allies of Nazi Germany, so Hungary, Romania, and so on. So they occupied these countries, and they established in these countries, more or less from Poland, Czech Republic, going to the Balkans, and then obviously Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary. All these countries were under sort of the control of the Soviet Union, and in various occasions, 1956, 1969, when they were somehow uprisings, wanted to get rid of the communist regime, they intervened with their troops. So this is the sort of the Soviet Union, and the countries that were bound to the Soviet Union by ideological lines, and by obviously by political and military force of the Soviet Union, the so-called Warsaw Pact, because it was this military agreement was signed in Warsaw, Poland. Now, this system went on, but it collapsed. That sort of quite a lot of very prophetic writings already in the 70s on sort of the fact that the Soviet Union would collapse from an economic point of view. It was not able to sustain sort of the needs of a very rather big population, and which was requiring more kind of economic, was looking for economic welfare, and the communist regime did not, the economic system did not, which was state planned, did not provide what the population was asking. So various things happened. I'll make a long story short. And in 1989, you've probably seen, maybe last year, because there was a 30th anniversary, sort of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which somehow represented a division between the East and the West, free West, and totalitarian East, that is Eastern Germany, which was under a very oppressive, very, very oppressive regime. Well, the fall of communist regimes in Russia, in the rest of Eastern Europe, this opened up the market. Not only these countries became countries which are, anyhow, they are no longer under communist regime, and they have more or less freedom. Well, there's a lot of discussion what is the amount of freedom that there is in Poland and Hungary of late, but in other countries, sort of Czech Republic, Slovakia, for example, not much discussion of what. So there's no doubt that the freedoms in the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, there's not much discussion about. So there's quite a lot of, they seem to be democratic countries where democracy works pretty well. And so this, what did this bring into the, we had all these countries, that means you see a couple of nearly 10, 12 countries, let's set aside the Balkans, which are complex history, but 10 countries that enter, plus Russia, Ukraine, that enter into the economic field and are need to obviously to have economic interchange, to trade, to acquire goods, services, and so on. This changes significantly the whole globalization. So first we had Russia and China, Russia, Eastern Europe and China, and the satellites of China, typically Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, which were under somehow very strong influence, Chinese influence. Well, we see that all this area, very vast area, becomes open to international trade and to a sort of capitalistic economy. So this has significant changes in significant consequences on sort of globalization. Now, this Di Domenico Antonio is asking, what about the IMO? Why does the International Tribunal of Hamburg only cover 149 states, according to Wikipedia? Now, one second. The International Tribunal of Hamburg, because there's an international treaty. There's an international treaty of law of the sea. And this international treaty has been signed by a limited number of countries. There are countries that have no access to the sea. I mean, in Europe, you just think of Europe, and we have Luxembourg that does not have access to the sea, Switzerland, and then we have Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, which are countries that do not have access to the sea. So you could say that, well, if you are a country that has no access to the sea, well, Paraguay, well, what is the sense of having, you know, you would not join the international treaty on the law of the sea. But the international treaty on the law of the sea is something that somehow is separated from the United Nations. It is different because the international treaty on the law of the sea establishes certain rules, fundamental rules, in formalizes some typical principles. For example, what do we mean for high sea and what are territorial waters? That is very important because when you are in the high sea, obviously this is very important. If you are in domestic waters, territorial waters, obviously it's something different. You are under the sovereignty of a state, and so the problem is establishing what is high sea, that is international waters, and what are instead territorial waters. Secondly, this international treaty establishes certain rules of what should be done at high seas. Just think of helping a ship in distress. When there's another ship in distress, all ships should somehow help this ship in distress. The notion of mutual help in the high seas and international waters. Or the principle of transit. The fact that you are able to transit in certain waters because you must go from one place to another. Just think of a ship that is going from Alexandria in Egypt and must go to Marseille in France. Now, what should he do? It could go all in international waters, but the easiest way is going up and passing through the Messina Straits, which are within Italian sovereignty, and because there are two parts of Italy, Calabria and Sicily. Now that is domestic territorial waters. Can Italy say, oh no, but you can't pass in this straits? If you want to go to Marseille, sorry, you have to go all around. You go around Sicily, go around Sardinia, and then you go up there, go to Marseille. No, so there's an international regime of straits, and there are some straits very delicate. Just think of the notion of the Bosphorus, that is where Istanbul is, and that is a very delicate issue because all the traffic from the Black Sea can come to the Mediterranean only passing through Turkish territorial waters. Or just think of the Suez Canal. So just to point out, the international, that is an international treaty, and that is one aspect. The International Maritime Organization instead is an international organization which is mostly, looks mostly at ships, maritime trade, at insurance. So it is, it is somehow different. Obviously, so the International Law of the Sea is a treaty on the law of the sea, regulates what happens on the high seas in international waters. The IMO sets standards which are useful for maritime activity. I hope I've been yeah, landlocked country. No, but I mean, listen, I mean, I just mentioned a few landlocked countries, but you will discover if you look at Switzerland has its own navy because it has lots of rivers and lakes, and you will find quite a lot of Swiss ships around. I mean, it's not the fact that you're landlocked doesn't mean that you can't have your own navy. Obviously, your own navy doesn't get home, but you can have your own navy. But I would doubt that sort of Rwanda has a navy, or Botswana has a navy. So some countries which are really landlocked and not very rich, I suppose, they do not have, not very interested in the law of the sea. But having said this, let's move on to these. Now, I'll try to present in a rather sort of a, try to make it easy. So we are in the, sort of, we're looking at economic aspects. So nothing better than Uncle Scrooge, which I hope you're familiar with, and he is a good representation of a typical American tycoon. I mean, he is well, he can be as nasty as Donald Trump. I mean, then sometimes he has very few occasions he has a good heart. But otherwise, he's sort of very much similar to the real Donald. Now, I'll try to, let's look at the IMF. I'll focus first point on the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. So, originally, you have, let's imagine that sort of we move back from 2020 to 1920, and you are an Italian citizen, a Belgian citizen, an English citizen, a US citizen, and you have a banknote in your pocket. Now, what is the value of that banknote is somehow related, according to the economic theory of that time, theory and practice, to the amount of gold reserves held by the central bank. So if the central bank has 1 ton, let's imagine 1 ton of gold bullion, you see a nice photograph of them, well, it can print as much money as equals the value of that bullion. So if you have 1 gold bullion, let's imagine that is worth, let's say, 1 million pounds, well, it wouldn't be 1 million pounds, that's 100,000 pounds. Well, you can do 100,000 £1 banknotes. So you find 1920, you would find a whole lot of banknotes with image of that king. I think it was George V at that time, or Edward VII. I'm not sure which of the two. I think it was George V. And you find his image on the banknote. And so if you had 1 bullion, you could print, the Bank of England could print 100,000 banknotes of £1. And if you had more, obviously, it was in proportion. Why was this? Because the banknote was somehow authorized, was like a promissory note saying, if you go to the central bank, you will receive the amount in gold. Why was this? To create trust, because people were very concerned of having these pieces of paper. They said, well, what is a piece of it? Hasn't any value, this piece of paper. I want this piece of paper to be linked to gold held by the state. So I will accept a banknote only if it is backed by gold. So this is the basic idea. So you could print, the state could print money as much as they held gold. If you had no gold, you had no money. And if you had lots of gold, you could print lots of money. You've all heard Fort Knox. Fort Knox is where the gold bullion of the Federal Reserve, of the US Federal Reserve, is held. It's a place in the middle of Kentucky, which is somehow unreachable, and it is the scene of numerous films. You find James Bond films and other kind of adventure films, all that are somehow people are trying to sort of steal all the gold held in Fort Knox. Now, what happens? After World War I, this system doesn't work. There's a huge economic crisis. They have to print, countries have to build money for reconstruction, and especially the UK and France, not France was very much damaged, but UK had lost enormous amount of soldiers and obviously lives in the World War I, and had suffered significant economic negative consequences from World War I. So they started printing money. And so they said, listen, the gold we hold is not sufficient to repay. If someone comes to the bank, Bank of England or Banque de France, and asks for the equivalent in gold, we don't have it. So we're going to eliminate this gold standard. So you have a banknote, but it is no longer backed by gold. So that is in the 30s, after the World War I and the financial crash of 1929. Well, England and France, which were two main countries, abandoned the gold standard. The US abandons the gold standard only much later, but again, of course, it's a war, the Vietnam War, 1971, President Nixon abandons the gold standard. So the problem is, when we have money, what is the value of this money? So why before it was quite easy, because you had the idea that the money was related to physical gold held by the central bank. So it represented a tiny fraction of the gold held. Now, what is it? What is the value of money? Now, this is something we leave to our economists and those who follow Pozzolo's lessons. Well, they can ask him. So, what is the value of money? Where do you find the value of money? What changes? Now, just to show you, this is gold bullion held in the treasury, the vaults of the Bank of England. Well, it gives a good idea of the Bank of England is pretty rich, and just look at it there, and sort of one thinks of what you could do with that gold bullion. Well, you could somehow have fun for the rest of your life. So let's talk when there was still the gold standard, that is, until the 19th century. First of all, the developed economies of the world were very few. There in Europe, countries, mostly European countries, US, well, at that time, Canada and Australia were still under British rule, so they were not independent. And a few Latin American countries were sufficiently rich. Let's imagine Brazil and Argentina, but the rest were pretty poor. And then there was Japan, and that's it, because, well, there was nothing else. So what happened in those times? Central bankers, and mostly the history is central bankers of Europe and of the US, the president of the US Federal Reserve, what did they do? They just met together and somehow 10 people, 12 people met together and stabilized the market. Now here you must understand a basic principle in international monetary economies. Now, if I export lots of products, I'm a country that exports lots of products, this means that my industry, my companies, receive lots of money. So I'm selling, let's imagine, lots of Ferraris, and all the money, Ferrari company based in Italy, receives lots of money coming from abroad. This money, obviously, if it's backed by gold, means that we are rich, and therefore we are have a stronger currency. This means that if you have lots of gold, you have a strong, strong currency. If you have little gold, obviously you have a very limited currency. Just remember the proportion, the fact that the currency, you can issue as much currency as you have gold. If you have little gold, you have little currency and therefore you're poor. If you have lots of gold, you can issue lots of currency and therefore you're rich. Just how much money you have in your pocket. So if your small country has little, not much money, if you are a rich country, you have lots and lots of money. Switzerland, which is a small country but has lots and lots of gold, has a very strong currency. Now, what happens in this idea of international trade and of so-called commercial surplus? If I export more than I import, because when I import, I'm sending money abroad and therefore I'm sending gold abroad, this means that if I have a commercial surplus, my currency goes up. Why does it go up? Because it means that my currency is more valuable because I have more gold. So I have one banknote, and that banknote has more value because there's more gold. So what does this mean? This has, from economic point of view, has negative consequences on international trade. Why? Because if you have a strong currency, you can go abroad and you can do lots of things. But when someone wants to come to you, has to buy your currency, it becomes difficult. Let's make it simple. Many of you maybe have gone to London, and we have seen from going from Europe, from continental Europe to London, which are the occasions in which it is convenient to go to London. When the pound is down, obviously we all go to London and we stay there and we enjoy our life in London, because this means that our euros are strong and we can go to London. But if the pound is very high, and this means that, and we go to London and we want to anything, the hotel room costs £100, which means, let's imagine, 150 euros. Well, we start saying, hey, it costs too much. So you realize that if and the same thing happens vice versa, when the pound is high, British tourists can come to Italy because what they buy doesn't cost much, And when instead the pound is down, obviously it is much more expensive for them to go abroad. So the system, how the system worked before abandoning the gold standard, but more or less, if the currency was very strong, this meant that there was less export, but it cost much more because you had to pay it in pounds, and the pound cost a lot. So you said, well, I won't buy products from England because they cost too much. I have Italian euros or French francs or German marks, so I won't buy an English product because it costs too much. And so this means that a country that has a strong currency exports much less, and therefore this means that much more gold comes back to that country, and therefore the things are balanced. This is the theory and more or less the practice that happened before until the 1970s. These 4, 5, 10 directors, presidents of central banks met together and settled these issues. Now, what happens after World War II? You have to find a different system to somehow avoid fluctuation in currencies. Why do you want to avoid fluctuation in currencies? We've seen this in international trade. If you buy a product, if you have an international contract and you are buying a product from the US and you're telling the US, your seller in the US that you're going to pay in euro, the American seller will say, hey, but what happens if the euro goes down, down, down? I don't want to be paid in money that is not any more valuable, or vice versa. If some American buys products from Europe and says, well, I'll pay you in dollars, we are obviously concerned on the fact that we are going to be paid we might be paid in dollars that have lost their value, have been depreciated. So how do we somehow avoid these significant fluctuations in the value of currency as we have set aside the gold standard? And here comes in, this is the role of IMF. Sorry, I made it rather long because just to show you what are the economic theories behind the IMF. So the IMF says, well, we don't have a gold standard, only the US has gold standard, but that's an exception. All the other countries, developed countries, have abandoned the gold standard. What are we going to do now? Obviously, this gold standard depends on the fact that, first of all, how much gold you have. And then what happens? It's a country, South Africa, which is one of the main producers of gold. What happens if South Africa, they discover a huge gold mine? Then this means that South Africa becomes so strong and we become so poor. So just to point out that South Africa at that time was still somehow under British control. So you're sort of concerned with the fact that the whole system might be upset by discovery of new gold mines. So what this IMF somehow should work, its function is that, of balancing excessive fluctuations of currencies, great depreciation of a currency owing to the fact of the unbalance of payments. Very strong commercial deficit. Why do Haiti and Gambia, which are two among the poorest countries in the world, their currency has no value? Because you can't buy practically anything with that money, because everything that comes is imported from abroad, and they have no wealth. They don't produce anything or very few products, few agricultural products, and that means that their currency is worth nothing, and therefore they can't do anything with this. So how do you somehow try to avoid very strong fluctuations, currency fluctuations? through the IMF. How does the IMF work? It is, remember, International Monetary Fund. Therefore, there's a fund. So each country puts in a certain amount of its quota, depending on the size of the country and its GDP. So just to point out that obviously when you are a small country, your quota is small, and when you're a big country, the US, obviously it's much higher. So you put it there and you somehow do a fund which is there to do mutual financial aid. So when a country finds itself in difficulty because it has been a very serious, dramatic financial crisis, and it has not been able to export anything, and it has to only be importing, and therefore there is a very strong trade deficit. Well, it asks help to the IMF, and the IMF provides what is called short-term, mostly a year, year and a half, financial resources to the amount of the quota. Obviously, if you're a small country and you put only a little bit of money, small quota in the fund, you can have only a certain amount. You can't have an enormous amount. And this is to correct balance of payments when there's a balance of payment deficit. This is economy. Okay, this is fine. Now, where do we lawyers realize that there's a whole lot of legal issues that come behind us, that come behind this help by the IMF? Legal issues and also political, constitutional, and a whole lot of other geopolitical issues. Because the IMF, when it provides this financial aid, doesn't say, okay, yeah, you're in the IC, you're in difficulty, you're quite right, you've had the coronavirus pandemic, and therefore you haven't been able to produce, you've been locked down, and therefore you haven't, your exports are very down, you've had to import medical equipment, masks, face masks, personal protective garments and so on, and medicines, and well, you haven't, and so you have this dramatic situation, and therefore I will give you some money that you will repay me in a year and a half. Yes, you will repay this in a year and a half, but the IMF does something more, and here is why we lawyers are interested. The aid that is provided by the IMF is under conditionalities. I've used this term because we see it now with the European Stability Mechanism. Are they conditions attached to the fact that the country asks help to the European Stability Mechanism? What are the conditions attached? Are they only interest rates, or are they other kinds of conditions? And these conditions that IMF sets are reforms of fiscal systems and economic policies. This means, what does this mean? We have to change the laws, because fiscal systems have to do with taxation law, and economic policies have to do with labor law, company law, business regulation, and welfare, social security, and so on. So just to point out that this is where we made a long, long history of IMF, and now we see where at a certain point enter the lawyer. So in the scene where there are only economists discussing here, there, so on, then, well, now we have to change the reform of fiscal systems and economic policy. And we see in the next slide what happens commonly. What are the typical conditions set by IMF for financial relief? And now these are sort of, they're not theoretical. These are many of these. When 6 years ago there was this dramatic financial crisis in Greece, and Greece asked for money to the IMF and obtained this money somehow through the European Union. Well, many of these conditions were set, the Greek government and parliament was told, well, if you want money from the IMF, well, you have to do these things. So cutting state expenditure. Okay. Okay. We'll cut these expenditures. No more cars, state officials will go to work with their own car, with their bus or with the metro, and that's it. Then increase of export, well, that makes it seems easy, but it isn't so easy. Devaluation of currency. Now, devaluation of currency is something that has very negative effects. Just think of people who are pensioners, people who live on a fixed income. If you devaluate the currency, this means that what they were buying before, the loaf of bread that they were buying before, costs more. Devaluation of 15 to 20% devaluation. So what cost before cost €1, now costs €1.20. So obviously they have a fixed income, and this has very negative consequences on the economic situation. But then trade liberalization and removal of import and export restrictions. Yeah, you have to intervene in the law and start saying, oh, but I'm not going to prevent imports or exports of certain products. So again, the law comes in. Increasing the stability of foreign investments, typically foreign direct investment, to attract investors in your country. Balanced budgets. Remember, we analyzed the principle of balanced budget in certain constitutions. We saw the Italian and Polish constitution have this principle of balanced budget. And what does this mean when it comes to public debt? So this has very significant consequences. Or removal of price control and state subsidies to domestic industries, privatization of state-owned enterprises. This is what, I mean, in Italy we did over the years somehow to bring in some money, improving governance and fighting corruption. And then obviously when we talk about cutting state expenditures, main expenditures that are cut are clearly pensions and health service. So what you do, you just cut down. This means reducing welfare system. So as you see, this is the IMF, the conditionalities of the set by the IMF to provide these short-term subsidies, aid, financial aid to rebalance the balance of payments, which is in deficit. Well, there are very, very strong consequences, which are, and here we see immediately what the implications are, seen as limitations of sovereignty and violation of constitutional rights and competences. There's an international organization set in Washington, D.C. Now this, by chance, no, by chance, it was set in Washington, D.C. because, well, in 1944, clearly the rest of the world wasn't very safe, and so they put it up in the U.S., which was a safe place to put it there. But it gives the idea that it's sort of somehow controlled by the Americans, not controlled by the USA, but it is there in Washington. So the idea is the IMF is some kind of some kind of emanation of the US government. It isn't like that. It's an international organization which has its own governance board, but and independent from the US, although obviously the US is a very important and influential members. But you see that immediately when you start telling a country, if you want money, I will give you money, I will lend you money, but not only you must give this money back to me, that seems quite obvious, but you must change this, change your welfare system, your taxation system, your organization, your trade system, and so on. Well, we are sort of telling, there's an international organization that tells a government, and therefore a democratic system tells Parliament, well, listen, if Parliament wants money, well, it has to do like this, it will have to change the law. Now you realize that if you think of this from a democratic theory, and we think of we the people, the idea that sort of the people that decide what should be what laws should be voted. Members of parliament represent the people. They don't represent international organizations. And they can be sort of, there's an international organization that tells members of parliament, listen, no problem, you can vote however you want, you vote just as you want. Just remember that if you don't vote this, you won't have any money. So it is a very strong pressure on democratic institutions. Let's set aside, let's forget about countries where there's no democracy. Just think of Greece, which is a democratic democracy. It's born in Greece and it's a democratic country. Well, you're telling sort of the Greek government and Greek parliament, listen, you want money? You have to do these things that I'm telling you. Obviously, you have to vote laws, you have to change your laws according to what I'm telling you and under these conditions. So just to point out that this, I've made you the Greek example because this is a very heated debate, and also in these times when we're discussing aid that could come to coronavirus-strict countries such as Italy or Spain or other countries which are in serious economic crisis owing to the pandemic, well, this is one of the main political, also legal and constitutional issues that is behind the aid that can come to us, to Italy or to other countries, with conditions attached or not attached. So just to point out, we're looking at this IMF, at this model of international stability, financial stability, and we see that there are very significant political and constitutional and legal issues attached to it. So this is why we're interested in understanding world economic governance, because it influences our legal systems. If we are a country, a democratic country, which finds itself in economic difficulty, well, what happens to our sovereignty and to what extent we can give up our sovereignty, pieces of our sovereignty in order to obtain money for reconstruction, for development and so on. So just to point out that this is a very, very delicate issue, and I think it's also for times we live in, it's important you should be aware of. Now, I just want to let's see if I can find my chat. Here we are. Okay. Sorry, I have to put my glasses on. Okay. Now. I realize maybe it's not, I haven't been able, I'm not an economist, as you can easily understand. I don't know if I've managed to transfer these basic principles of international monetary theory, but just to show you that sort of we have to understand this, and you have to. I encourage you to understand these principles, because if you don't understand these principles, then it is difficult for you to understand what are the legal constitutional legal consequences of economic crisis. Are there any questions on this part? Have you all escaped from lockdown? Any other questions concerning our Uncle Scrooge and his diving in his gold-plated and gold-filled swimming pool? Who's in charge of IMF? Well, there's a governing board. I think it's made of 25 members. Now the chairman of the director general of IMF was until last autumn was Christine Lagarde, Frenchman woman, who now is president of the European Central Bank, and her place has been taken by another woman, Kristeva, Mrs. Kristeva, who's Bulgarian of origin, who is now director of the IMF. There is a governing board made of, if I correct, 25 members, and they somehow determine what are the strategies of the IMF. If you go on the website of the IMF, for example, you will see what are somehow the strategies of the IMF in facing this dramatic economic crisis that hit in Europe, but lots of other countries are hit by the coronavirus pandemic, and therefore trying to understand how to face these consequences. So it is an international organization. Obviously, some states are more important because they have more bigger quota and are substantially those who are putting more money in the fund. But it is an international organization. It is pretty complex organization because we're talking of very big building in Washington, and with thousands of employees, mostly economists, who are somehow trying to find the correct recipes for solving these economic crises. If you go on the IMF website, you will find lots of interesting information, what's going on now and what will be going on in the next months, and how these international organizations will somehow manage to enter sort of govern the crisis, economic crisis, financial crisis. Let's take an example. Italy needs money and then says, well, I'll ask money to IMF. IMF will put conditionalities behind it and saying, well, but if you want this money, there's no difference between I do the same thing. What I did with Greece, I'll do it with you. You must do this, this, and that. Will we accept it? And so just to point out this, I won't enter the debate, but this is a very, very important aspect in our contemporary societies, because this shows that we think we have a national state that can decide in sovereignty, and then we realize that certain amount of decisions we can take in complete autonomy, but many other decisions we have to take with other international organizations, with international partners. Now this is, so I hope I've answered to Salvatici. World Bank does in different compared to the IMF. We'll see this next week. Sorry, I didn't manage to do this. So this is what Zina is asking, and I'll compare it. It's different. The World Bank is a bank, while the IMF is a fund. It is really a bank and works like a bank. Giovanniello has a question, but the question is, he must open the mic, and Giovanniello, you must put your... Can you hear me? You must, I can't hear you, sorry very much. And let's see if I can, let me just, maybe it's my microphone that is. Can you speak, Giovanniello?
Yes, can you hear me?
Not very well.
Uh,
You should raise your volume a little bit. I put
oh,
my volume very high up.
and me too. But I can write if you want.
Okay,
It's
just write the question and
okay.
then I'll so Zinai will next week we'll analyze differences between IMF and the World Bank. Panagia, is there a criteria in order to be part of rotating countries in the Security Council? Now, this is very much to do with geopolitics. Obviously, you will find some kind of alliances which are regional alliances, Latin American countries, which say, well, they must be a Latin American country there. But obviously, not all Latin American countries agree. Maybe sort of Venezuela has a certain position, and just think of Maduro and Bolsonaro. Just let's take these two presidents of two countries which are even bordering and which have sort of rather different views on sort of political views. So I mean, they need alliances. So there's some kind of, as they have to be voted by all the General Assembly. Well, there's a consensus, and sort of people who are not appreciated are kept out of the door, and they sort of but generally they are regional agreements. So the Asian countries say, well, we will pick these two countries, Thailand and let's say and Pakistan, and then the Latin American countries will say, we'll have one big country, let's say Argentina, and a small country, Guatemala, and then African countries, which are lots, and then they will sort of establish more countries sort of from the north of Sahara, that is Arab Africa, will represent, and which are Saharan countries. So it is a very much political issue. There's no principle. But the idea is that in the Security Council, all parts of the world should be represented. They can't be all European, all African, all Asian. They must be a sort of equal representation of the various parts of the world on the basis, obviously, of a diplomatic and political agreement between the members of the UN. Now, are the typical, Badi is asking, are the typical conditions set by IMF for financial relief some strategies through which it intervenes in order to support countries? I don't know if I understood correctly. The idea is this, the economic seriousness. You have a trade deficit because you are spending too much and you are producing and exporting too little. So this is the economic theory. We're not here to discuss it. This is the basic idea behind it. So what we must do, I will help you solve your trade deficit problem, but I don't want it to repeat itself, because if I just give you money and then you won't be able to repay me this money because your system, your economic system doesn't work. So the only way you can repay me is if you put order in your accounts, if in your economy. If your economy goes well, then you will be able to repay me. If your economy goes badly, well, you won't be able to repay me. So as a guarantee to be repaid, I want you to take these reforms. The first reform is that of reducing public expenditure, and then a whole lot of other guarantees. Notice, I think the Greek experience is very interesting because we have a democratic country. There was extreme left-wing party in government, Syriza, at that time was a very strong sort of politician, Tsipras, and he managed to, he was forced to leave these very left-wing positions and somehow agree to the IMF conditions. But what is very significant that over these last years, well, Greece has repaid its debts. I don't say that its financial conditions, its economic conditions are flourishing, but it has managed to repay its debt. So just to point out that, so these conditions which are put are somehow the guarantees that the IMF asks. The IMF doesn't ask you for putting gold bullion and saying, well, I'll lend you the money if you put your gold bullion here in the world, in the IMF. No, I will give you the money if you change and you modify your economic system. Now let's forget about developing countries which are in a different situation. Let's forget about authoritarian countries which are, obviously they can decide whatever they want. Let's talk of democracies. So what we are interested in understanding is these conditions which are set in order to receive financial relief. How much do they impinge on national sovereignty and constitutional prerogatives of democratic institutions, noticeably the parliament? So, well, this is a great area of debate, which I think obviously you would find an enormous amount of literature on this point. But this is, when I repeat, look at this look at the past Greece, look at now the problem of the European Stability Mechanism. When the European Stability Mechanism says, we will give you money, but there are conditions. What are the conditions? Well, for the moment, the only condition seems to be that of spending that money only in medical equipment and in public health. Okay, then that is, okay, that could be a reasonable condition. But if you start saying, well, now you must change your welfare system, then obviously that could create some certain amount of political issues. Did you receive, sorry, I sent you yesterday the decision or rather, press release of the decision taken yesterday by the German Constitutional Court. Did you receive it?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
because that is, sorry, it is not related, it's related to 2015. So to the quantitative easing, I won't, you asked Professor Pozzolo, who's an expert in this field, what is quantitative easing, but it's somehow, it's like printing money, more or less, from a practical point of view. So putting money, throwing money into the system when there's not enough money, financial resources. But what the German Constitutional Court has said yesterday is substantially telling the European Central Bank, no, you're not going to give money to Europe like that. You're not going to spend our German money to help Spain, Portugal, Italy, or some other country in distress. Listen, you cannot use Central European Bank. Well, you can do only certain things, but you cannot do other things. So just to point out that this is becoming a very hot political and legal issue because it has to do with the interpretation of the treaty. There's this quarrel. I mean, if you want, there's also the whole text. If you go on the website of the German Constitutional Court, you find the whole English translation for those who are not, who do not understand German. Legal German is pretty complex. Well, there's the English translation. You see, there's the whole this 94 pages of decision. Well, 50 pages are somehow the sort of the German Constitutional Court, which is shooting against, putting all its missiles, its cannons against the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, which previously had said that, European Court of Justice decided financial stability in Europe and therefore decided what could be done, what could not be done. And the German Constitutional Court said, no, isn't this, you went well beyond your prerogatives, went ultra vires, the whole thing, you will find ultra vires repeated 50 times in that decision, saying that the European Court of Justice did what it should not. It went well beyond its powers. So just to point out that this is a very complex legal but political issue and economic issue that will have significant consequences in the next month. So I would like to just to show you that we're talking about comparative legal systems of systems which apparently somehow are outside history, or we can somehow keep history outside or just look at the past, but we should also look at the present. And the present is, well, troubling and and but at the same time very engaging, because I hope you sort of take advantage of trying to understand these mechanisms now that you're your first year of having students' first year of university, and understand what are the economic, constitutional, and practical legal aspects of this economic crisis. Now, this is Shabadi that asked me then question. Then let's see if there are other questions. Oh, Joaniello here. On which place are the IMF conditions set between the sources of law? Are they sub-constitutional place, or are they binding? No, they're just no, they're just simply, they are based on you find they are inside the charter of the IMF. The IMF says what are, and the regulations and bylaws of the IMF say, well, I will give money, I will lend money to the states, the members of the IMF, on certain conditions. So there is an agreement between the government and the IMF. So it is simply an agreement. Now this agreement becomes effective, and in this agreement is said a whole lot of things, saying you will receive, let's say, 10 billion, 100 billion euros in 1 year, and you must engage in doing this. And this agreement will become effective only when the authorities, Parliament, in this case a democratic system, Parliament, will do these certain things. So it's somehow, if you want, it's a contract. It's not really a contract because it's an agreement between an international organization and a state, a state of that international organization, in which, in clear, bold, black letter words, it's established very clearly what that country must do. So it's not a source of the law. It isn't that it influences somehow that the IMF can enforce that agreement on Italy, on Greece, or it just says, well, you just follow these conditions. If you want the money, you must abide by these conditions. If you don't abide by these conditions, you won't have them, you won't see the money. As simple as that. So it's not a source of the law. It's simply, it's something that in order that this funding becomes, this financial relief becomes actually effective, well, the country must do certain things, and must do it with legal instruments, not with simply promising, because the IMF knows very well that, there's a government changes, the majority changes in Parliament, and then the government says, oh, but this was the previous government that said certain things. That just paper just tears the agreement up. No, it must be written in law, and when the Parliament changes the law according to what the IMF wants, so well, then the money will arrive. So it's not a source of the law. So I hope I've been clear with this to join in. So it's not a source of law. It's just an obligation of the state towards an international organization, which therefore has governs what must be done in that state, in that democratic state. Greek case is very, very clear, very good in all the debate that there was around that. I hope I've been clear enough. Now just to say, okay. Then if there are no more questions for today, what we'll reconvene next week, and I'll finish with the World Bank, and then I'll start with the WTO, which is also very important. And well, next week is already 11th, and then I would like to discuss with you sometime next week sort of the exams, because we're sort of getting sort of pretty near to June, and I'd like to somehow focus. I think you are interested in focusing on the exam. I'm less interested, or rather it's something that is, I prefer doing lessons and doing exams, but I know you're concerned, and so next week we can discuss that. So for the moment being, we stop here and enjoy the rest of the week and this afternoon and the week. Leave your name, those who joined after 5 past 5.